a living history production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello and welcome to another episode of BattleWalks, where we are walking the great battlefields of Europe. Thank you so much to my talented co-host Pete Smith for filling in for the last couple of weeks while I wasn't well. What a fantastic job he did. I really enjoyed listening to those podcasts because, of course, doing them on his own, I hadn't heard them. And getting the opportunity to go and listen to Pete actually walking the battlefields was, there was a large streak of jealousy in there that Pete can get out and stroll the battlefields. But gee, what a wonderful experience. If you haven't listened to those last couple of episodes where Pete was out live on the battlefields, exploring in real time the battlefields, and particularly the caves of Noah. Geez, I've said that. I've made a good meal of that, Pete. I'm going to give up completely and just introduce my co-host, Pete. Noah. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, your pronunciation of French is, you've obviously caught that off me, or lack of pronunciation of
I used to be able
French.
to do it. Yeah. I used to be able to do it. But Pete, welcome back to the show. Thank you for carrying the load while I was away.
No, it was good fun, and something that I'm hoping that we'll continue getting out there and doing some literal recordings while we're walking the ground.
Yeah, we'll do more and more. And my mangled French there was talking about the caves at Naor, the underground city where the soldiers visited as tourists, basically, during the First World War, and left their mark, literally, by writing their names on the walls of the caves, which we can now go and see today. Just an extraordinary place. I've loved visiting there. Had the privilege of visiting there with you, Pete, a couple of years ago now, and just an extraordinary place. That was a really wonderful podcast.
It's one of those places that you get hooked in going back to and looking at the names, and you just want to know more about the people that signed their names there. And there's not been a great deal of research done on the British soldiers that signed their names, mainly because they're a little bit more difficult to research. I'm having a crack at doing a few more. So it's fascinating. There's years of research in there. One of the things that I don't know if we've mentioned it in the podcast, but there are a group of American airmen that sign their names there as well, and Americans have become quite excited about some of their men signing their names in there.
It's great. Just another of the unsolved mysteries the First World War keeps delivering up to us. There's so many more of these stories to tell. The feedback, thank you to everyone who sent us feedback about that episode, because we did get a lot, because it was a little bit different to what we've done before, and a lot of feedback along the lines of a little bit different to your normal episodes, but really enjoyable. So I think that summed it up really well, Pete.
Yeah, it's good. That's excellent. And let's. I think we'll try and find some more similar type sites to visit.
Excellent. I look forward to hearing those and to actually walking the ground with you when we're allowed to travel again. But today we're heading to, again, a story that's probably not so well known. We're heading to a very important First World War site, but we're telling a Second World War story. Tell us a little bit about what we're doing in Amiens today.
Well, we're going to be starting off at the railway station, and we're going to be covering a Mosquito Squadron raid on the prison, known as Operation Jericho. It's one of those stories. I think I remember my father telling me about it years and years ago. And I have to say, Amiens is a pick-up point for doing the exploring the battlefields of the First World War, and on the route in and on the route out, you actually go past the prison. And I must have gone past it, 20, 30, 50 times or more, before I just glanced to my right as I was driving in one morning and realised that there was the bricks were a different colour in an area, and it was in a V shape, which obviously kind of was trying to show you something. And what it's trying to show you is where the walls were blown out in that area during the raid. So it's commemorated on the outside of the prison. It is still a prison, interestingly enough. It was a prison before the Second World War, and is still a prison today. So noticed it and thought, hang on a minute, I remember my father talking about a raid on Amiens prison, and then looking it up, and it now has become part of my tour. When I'm exploring the battlefields, First or Second World War, then we always stop and have a quick chat about what was known as Operation Jericho. So today we're going to be walking from the railway station. It's only about a 5-kilometre walk up a main boulevard, around the corner and to the prison, and we'll be chatting as we walk.
It's, I think, one of the things we all love about the Second World War. Okay, love's not quite the right word, but the thing that we are all fascinated about by the Second World War, it's just these stories of daring do, these raids, these incredible use of technology. I mean, it really was a conflict where where the great minds stretched to new and interesting areas, wasn't it? And this is an absolutely perfect example of that exactly.
Well, I think it also brings people to the fore as well. Group Captain Percy Pickard, known as Picard, he was the man that led the raid. Unfortunately, he will lose his life, as we'll learn later on. But he was a character in his own right. He was a very flamboyant character. And I think these kind of actions suit these men that are flamboyant so an interesting chap in his own right, as we'll learn.
Well, let's start with a really important question. Why are a bunch of British aircraft bombing the walls of a prison in a French town?
Well, that is a question that actually at one time I would have answered and said, and it will be the story that I'm going to tell you. But there's some doubt now. It will become apparent as we tell this story. There's some doubt as to why the raid took place. So what I'm going to do is explain, first of all, why the raid, the general view of why the raid took place. It's to free prisoners. It's to free prisoners who are going to be executed. It was supposed to have been a request by the resistance. Could you try and free these prisoners? They're all going to be executed, so we've got nothing to lose if some are killed in the raid. And what they're asking the RAF to do is to basically take out the walls, drop a bomb by the side of the prison, blow the doors off effectively, hit the accommodation block for the guards and anything else, the mess hall for the guards, and try and kill as many guards as possible and give as many of the resistance men or anybody else that's in there, because of course it is a prison. There are your general day-to-day prisoners in there as well, criminals. But to let everybody get out, two things: it will save their lives. It will also mean that the Germans have to tie down some troops in trying to gather them in. This is taking place. I haven't said the date, I don't think. This is taking place in 1944, the 18th of February. So it's the start of the build-up to D-Day, and certainly one of the stories that goes with this is that one of the guys in there may have some information that is relevant to D-Day, and so that's one of the reasons why we have to get him out of there in case he gets tortured and the information gets extracted from him. So there's all sorts of these little stories that go with it, some of which have been proven to not be true, some of which are true, but it doesn't really matter, because the important thing is the raid did take place, and it was a success. I mean, there's no doubt about it. We can see the hole in the wall as we go past it. It was a success. So it's a fascinating little sideline almost of the history of the Second World War. Just a few hours and then it was over. But very important for this accurate bombing, because this is, of course, is new. Really, really accurate bombing. Taking out the wall of a prison.
Well, let's talk about the city of Amiens as well, because it's very well known to people who visit the Somme region to follow the First World War exploits in that area. It was absolutely vital to what went on during the First World War, particularly in 1918. Talk to us a little bit about Amiens, and then let's talk about something it isn't well known for, which was its significance during the Second World War.
Yeah, well, the significance really is the same for First and Second World War. It's on a river, and most important cities tend to be on rivers. It's on a route towards Paris, so again, in both wars, it's a blocking point, or has the potential to be a blocking point. It's main railway lines. There's a rail network connected to it, a road network, and even a canal network. So it's an important hub. In both world wars, the trade, the major profession of people living and working in the city was to do with the production of cloth, so it's weaving. Long gone, actually. It kind of came to an end in the 1950s, so there's very little weaving, I think, if any, takes place in Amiens, but that's where the wealth of the wealth of the city came from, was weaving. It's the capital of Picardy, and a population now of about 134,000 people live in the city. So it's a big city. It's my capital city for this region, so it's where I would go, certainly when we have to, for a variety of reasons, whether it be changing a car or getting almost all the big forms that you need to live in France. Then you would get them from, if you live in this area, from Amiens.
And your French president, of course, is from Amiens as well.
He is indeed, in fact, on the road that we're going to walk up, you'll see his name Macron on one of the shop fronts. It's a defunct shop, doesn't exist anymore, but it's obviously was a family run concern, and his name is on the wall there. So yes, famous people from Amiens. Well, him really, and one other, Jules Verne. He lived there for a lot of his life in Amiens, and you'll find that a lot of things around the city are named after him. So we have the bypass around the city is the Jules Verne bypass, a bridge over the Somme, the Jules Verne bridge. So yeah, his name appears. Jules Verne Theatre, I think. They use his name a lot.
Well, let's begin our walk, Pete, because we're going to stroll through the city of Amiens. It's a great city to stroll through. I really enjoy visiting Amiens. Really a lovely place down by the River Somme, the incredible cathedral. If you go to Amiens, go down to the Somme and have a beer and a meal down by the river, and go and see the absolutely incredible cathedral in the centre of town. Just iconic, one of the most impressive in France. It's a beautiful city. Let's begin walking through it, Pete, and telling the story of Operation Jericho.
Okay, well, we're standing in front of the railway station, so I better say a little bit about the railway station, because railway stations are always in the centre of the city, or tend to be, and this one is. And because of that, it was bombed during the Second World War. And destroyed totally by long-range shelling in the First World War. So I think we'll start with a quick whiz through the First World War on Amiens. So I often used to think that Amiens wasn't overly, because it was only very briefly captured in 1914, and then the population came back, and the Germans never got to it again. But in 1918, then they get fairly close. They get as close as Villers-Bretonneux, which involves Australians fighting and holding them at Villers-Bretonneux. But they also then start building some very big guns. They bring up a railway gun known as the Amiens gun, and they shell the city and they bomb the city on a regular basis. And I used to quite kind of glibly say, it wasn't that badly damaged. And I suppose compared to Ypres, which was almost completely flattened, and my village flattened, a lot of the villages flattened, but there were 152 civilians killed in the town, and 213 were wounded. And then the actual material damage, 731 buildings were totally destroyed. So that's an awful lot of damage, and 3,000 very badly damaged. So the destruction of the city in 1914-18 was quite considerable. But it's by far worse in the Second World War, because it is very firmly in 1940 in the way of the Germans trying to get to Paris. And so it was very heavily bombed during June of 1940, during the Battle of Amiens, and during the Battle of France in the May of 1940, it heavily bombed again. And then the German 1st Panzer Division entered the city on the 18th of May. So a lot of fighting going along around the city for quite some time. And in fact, French guns shelled it in the June of 1940 because the Germans are in the city, and British were there as well. The British were back here, having fought around the city in the First World War, and the 7th Battalion of the Royal Sussex Regiment fought to defend the town, and they were there as well. So we have a very big rail goods yards at a place called Longo, just outside the city, and that also took a lot of bombing in the June of 1944. And this is because from that area and from other areas in France, the Germans would resupply down to the Normandy front, where the D-Day landings have taken place. So it was essential that we stopped the Germans from resupplying down there, and so we took up the rail network. And of course, sadly, some of those bombs fell on the city as well. So very, very badly bombed. I tried to find the actual casualties for civilian casualties in the Second World War, and I can't find them. The French don't like, and this is a big generalisation, but they don't like talking about the Second World War. It is one of those things that divides society in France. So yes, there are books written, yes, there are societies that do research, but generally speaking, it's not easy to find that information when you're looking for things like casualty figures. But yes, a lot of civilians killed in the Allied bombing of the rail network in around Amiens. And eventually, in 31st of August 1944, it was liberated by the 11th Armoured Division of 30 Corps, and they're heading. They're famous for their trying to get to Arnhem. That's what a lot of people remember. 30 Corps the tanks trying to get through to the paratroopers at the bridges of Arnhem, but liberated, as I say, in the 31st of August 1944.
There's a couple of interesting things, Pete, there about the Second World War that I want to focus on. Firstly, this concept that these towns were the seesawing nature of the fighting. So in 1940, the Germans came through and obviously attacked the town as they came through and captured it, and then were successful in capturing it as they had not been during the First World War. But then, of course, the Allies retaliating, trying to get the town back, trying to hold the Germans, so the town being shelled and bombed again. So just if you're a civilian there would have been bombs falling on you just about every day. The only thing that changed was where those bombs were manufactured. Just must have been the seesawing nature. And then again, the fighting returns in 1944. Again, the town attacked by the Allies, then heavy fighting to secure it. Just how... I don't think we quite comprehend how badly some of these lesser-known cities were knocked around during the Second World War. We know all about the Blitz on London. We know all about, obviously Dresden being flattened and all of these terrible stories about the cities that were obliterated. But just about every major centre in Western Europe was affected, wasn't it?
It was indeed, and interestingly, I've been doing a little bit of work in the villages in the rear areas here to do with the First World War mainly, but what I've also been looking at are the war memorials, and it's amazing the number of civilian casualties from the Second World War who lost their lives during that period in 1944 as we retook these villages from the Germans. And you can see what's happening. They're getting excited and they come out into the streets to celebrate the arrival of the Allies and then get themselves killed by one side or the other. So yeah, very sad. And you do have to sometimes just sit back and think about the French and what they went through during this period and how it affected them for the future, and perhaps sometimes what their viewpoint of the British and the Americans are, because we do cause an awful lot of deaths in France at various times.
I've got some family members in the French city of Nantes, and the grandmother, before she passed away, talked when she was a young girl living in the town and spoke with horror about not the German occupation, not 1940 when the Germans first arrived. The bit she spoke about with horror was the bombing, particularly in 1944, as the Allies softened up France for the invasion in the lead up to D-Day. And that was the bit that shocked her, and she burst into tears telling me about the bodies lying in the street after Allied bombing raids. Just a horrific time for, obviously, it's a silly thing to say. Just we can't comprehend what the civilians went through in Europe during the Second World War.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's very hard to. I try sometimes, and especially because I live in France, and I think about the farmer that lived in this house during the Second World War and what he saw, and I'm aware of what happened in this area, and yeah, you do wonder how this survived. But people do. People manage. People get by. People continue to live and to thrive in some cases. But yeah, it must have been fairly tough.
Something else you mentioned, Pete, was that it was British troops that came through and liberated the town in 1944. Was there have you seen in your research any connection between the British soldiers of the Second World War? I mean, Amiens is such an icon from the First World War. They must have grown up with their fathers telling them stories about being in Amiens and seeing the cathedral and walking through the streets of Amiens during the First World War. Is there any record of British soldiers when they came back through this area noting the significance of the town to the First World War?
Yeah, what you'll find, because in 1940, when the BEF came to France and we have the Phoney War, then we occupied this area. This is an area that was under British control again. There were petrol dumps and training establishments here, and an awful lot of the older soldiers in the army, the instructors, the sergeants, the senior NCOs, were First World War veterans. So these are guys actually coming back to their battlefields that they had fought over in the First World War. Now, as we're forced back to Dunkirk and then eventually across the Channel, most of those guys who had fought in the First World War and then fought in that period in 1940 are put into training jobs. So by the time we get to 1944 and our return, then there will be very few people who would actually have had been here either in 1940 or in 1914-18. But certainly it was in the British psyche that the battles of the Somme, Passchendaele, all of those well-known actions that they would have been spoken about, talked about as children. Then they would have then been very much aware of where they were as they crossed the cemeteries. The cemeteries, the most, I suppose, iconic for everybody, the most iconic sights that you see as you're crossing those white stones, those white headstones, and the cross of sacrifice, so visible and so well known. Then these guys, as they whistle by on tanks or in vehicles, would have known exactly where they were, and must have made them feel odd, I suppose, knowing knowing that their fathers, in some cases, had fought in the same area.
And something else, Pete, that I didn't understand is we always assumed that during the Second World War, a town like Amiens was bombed and damaged and destroyed. And I always just imagined that they just sat in that state until after the war. In the 1950s, people came back and rebuilt them. But you told me that the reconstruction of the town of Amiens began during the war. Talk to me about that.
Well, you have to remember that the Germans, once they'd taken France, are building the Atlantic Wall. So this is new Germany. This is the expansionism of Germany. This is now a place they control, and they want to hang on to it. But it's more than that. This is now their city. Amiens is their city, and so they're actually clearing the roads of any bomb damage that had taken place in that period in 1940. They're planning the layout of the city, rebuilding it, and in fact they're actually using a French architect, a chap called Pierre Dufault, who started planning the rebuilding of the city in 1942, and I find that fascinating that he'd been literally recruited by the Germans to rebuild the town.
Well, as we leave the railway station, Pete, where are we going to walk to next in the town?
Right, so we're going to head out to the railway station. I just should say, by the way, the railway station, if you're interested in 1950s architecture, is classic kind of...
Who isn't?
Brutalism. It's a very interesting railway station, and opposite it we have, and it was built at the same time, a tower. I tend to call it the sauce bottle. It is not a particularly attractive tower, but it's in the same style as the railway station. So if you're interested in 1950s brutalism, a lot of concrete. But it has been improved in the last 10 years. They built a great big glass dome over, or roof over the plaza, the place in front of the railway station, and that's where we're going to start. So that's, I think it's quite attractive. They have fountains and things there, so it's quite relaxing. Very safe. It's a safe railway station, and they're always the best railway stations, but this one always feels okay to me. The
tower in Amiens is a funny thing, isn't it, Pete? Because it is just so weird. I mean, it's actually quite impressive that in 1955 they were building these needle-thin, very, very tall apartment blocks, and it's a bizarre sight. You're right, it's very ugly. No one likes it. It's such an icon. As you drive into it, because we go out, when we do a tour, we go out, spend a day on the battlefields, and then often stay in Amiens. So we return to the city at the end of a long day, and as you approach it, you just see this huge, ugly tower towering over the city. But it's bizarre. You're right. It doesn't look modern. It looks very old, and it is very old, and it's just a very strange thing.
Well, in researching for this podcast, apparently it's been totally renovated inside. So I'd love to have a look at one of the apartments inside to see what they're like. So it's they light it up as well. It's lit up in strange colours during the evenings as well. I think why I'm not keen on it, and Matt, I'm sure would agree with this, is because it kind of dwarfs the beautiful cathedral. You know, you've got this medieval cathedral, which is fantastic. You can see it from a long way off. But what you can also see is this brand new tower. So very, very different, 1950s and Middle Ages, almost alongside each other.
It would be remiss of us not to mention the cathedral briefly. We're not going past it on this walk, but just how spectacular is the cathedral. It's larger in area than Notre Dame in Paris, I was reading recently, and it's just spectacular and just an icon to troops of the First and Second World Wars. It just, particularly in the First World War, the troops that so many troops spent so much time in Amiens, and the cathedral was obviously the highlight, slightly damaged during the war. But in the collection of the Australian War Memorial, for example, there are so many postcards and photographs that troops took of the cathedral. And if you go and jump on the Australian War Memorial website and search their collection and type in Amiens Cathedral, you will see hundreds of photos of troops in and around the cathedral. Just an icon of the battlefields.
It is, and it still is an icon for lots of people. They have a light display during the summer on the front of it when it gets dark, which is spectacular. In my collection, for those who've listened to the podcast before, they'll know I'm a bit of a collector of Great War memorabilia, and I have a leaflet produced by a British padre, which is a guide to the cathedral. So they were actually handing these things out to the troops as they went into town. Go and have a look at the cathedral rather than go to a brothel, I think was probably the instructions they were given, and given this guidebook, and off they went to go and have a look at the cathedral, and it is spectacular. It's well worth if you're in the town, go and have a look.
I'm sure those troops, Pete, found time to do both. A quick duck into the cathedral and then round the corner to see a local madam. I certainly don't doubt that. Many of the accounts I've read, they were very open about how they spent their leisure time, as you can well imagine.
I can, yeah.
And the other icon of the city is not just the cathedral, but the Somme River, of course, the iconic Somme River. Not a lot of the fighting in the First World War actually took place anywhere near the banks of the Somme, but obviously the whole area is named after the river, and the river was an icon for the troops again. And the Somme passes right through the centre of town.
It does indeed, and it really it splits the town in a beautiful way. It runs through it. When we have some of our groups in the town, we often eat by the side of the river. A lot of restaurants down by the river. In the summer, you can go to the hortelages. I always say this wrong. Hortelages. That sounds better. What they are, they're sometimes known as the floating gardens. They're not floating at all. They're little tiny islands divided by the river. The river flows out into a floodplain, I suppose, really. And these were for growing organic vegetables. They also grow flowers as well. And it's very beautiful. You can get little punts, basically, and go around there, be taken around there, or you can go on a bigger trip on a slightly larger vessel. So it's again, it's probably the second thing that people do. They go to the cathedral and they go onto these to go and have a look at these floating flower beds and organic vegetables.
Do you enjoy that experience, Pete? Every time you've done it, do you enjoy that experience? You must have done it hundreds of times. How many times have you visited the hortelonnage?
You know jolly well I've not been at all.
You're too busy out on the battlefields.
I am indeed. Yeah, I do fancy a trip, but I just don't quite seem to fit it in.
You should do it. I've done it once. I did it the first time I visited the battlefields 20 years ago. Actually, geez, it is 20 years ago now. That's crazy to think. First time I visited the Western Front, I did it, and it was actually really lovely. It's highly unusual. It's so French. It's highly unusual. It's all in French. You get in a little punt, and someone, I can't remember whether it was a motor or whether he rowed us around, but I think it was a little motored boat, and you putt around, and there's farmers working on their little veggie patches, as you say, on little islands in the middle of the river. It's beautiful and very strange and very French. And my fond memory of it was, as we went out, the guide was, obviously it was all in French, and the guide was asking where everyone was from. And it's a very French tourist attraction. You don't get non-French people coming there. And he was going around asking where everyone was from, and most people were from Amiens, and maybe someone was from like Albert, a little bit further in the Somme. And I remember one gentleman thrust out his chest and very proudly said he was from the Loire Atlantique. So he was from the Loire coast, about 2 hours away, and he was very proud that he'd come so far. And everyone was like, "Oh, very good," and a light round of applause that this gentleman had travelled so far to come to Amiens. And then they got to us. "Where are you from?" "Australia." Whoa! It was just one of those great moments of connection with the local people, which I love when you travel. But it is a really bizarre and fascinating little thing. I've seen nothing like it anywhere else in the world. I can't imagine that farming on these minuscule little islands in the middle of the river is actually an economic prospect. But they do it and they enjoy it and they go well. And it's well worth doing when you go to Amiens.
I think it's more of hobbyist farmers, I think. A lot of them go on, just about to mention, on a Saturday, there's the market, and the market just beside the river, and it sells all the organic vegetables grown there. Again, have I been? I've been past it a few times, but it's very popular for the local people to go and buy these organic vegetables. But you're absolutely right, Matt. It is a very, very French outing, a very, very French day out, I think.
So, Pete, leaving the hortelonnage, where to next?
Yeah, so just to put it so you understand, we turned right out of the railway station, down a slope, over the river, and now we're heading up a superb boulevard, and into an area known as Saint-Pierre, and the Boulevard de Bourville. And it's so wide. I remember the first time I drove down here, I thought, surely they can't have planned this. And this would have been planned in the 1830s, I suppose, 1840s. And it's basically got, I'll explain how many lanes of traffic. You've got local traffic on the outsides, on each side of this boulevard. You've then got a bus lane. And then you have 2 lanes on each side of day-to-day traffic moving about. So, I just found it extraordinary. 8 lanes of highway on a Victorian boulevard, and I think that gives you an idea of how Amiens was perceived at that time as they were developing the city. This was going to be an all-singing, all-dancing city with big, wide boulevards, lots of trees, as it still is. It's tree-lined up and down the sides. The houses are brick and. Not dissimilar to the type of house that you would possibly find in Britain at the same time. They're terrace rows, but with nice big houses in amongst them as well. So it's a nice shaded walk. We're walking up the side. It's quiet because we're away from the main road, even though it's a busy main road. It is one of the main routes into the city, from the north of the city anyway. On our right-hand side, we're going to go to a hospital called Hospital St. Victor, built about roughly the same time, and it's part of the story. We've already mentioned that lots of prisoners escaped because it was a successful raid. Well, of course, they've got to hide. They've got to hide somewhere. And the hospital, the nurses and the doctors saw these guys running down the streets, covered in dust because, of course, the bombing had blown up dust everywhere. So they were very obviously the escaped prisoners. And what they did was they dragged quite a few into the hospital, put them into beds, wiped their faces to get the dust and hair to get the dust off them, pulled the blankets over their clothes, because the Germans were fairly much hot on their tails and pretended they were people in the hospital. So the hospital is part of the story. I tried to learn a little bit more about the hospital and its age and when it was built, and again, very difficult. Couldn't find anything about it online, so I can't add anything more than that. But it still exists. It's now not a hospital in that sense. I think it looks after the elderly, and I think there's a training section of it as well. So, but it still exists. And it's amazing what does still exist from this period. And interestingly, we are at the side of the city that was heavily bombed. It was heavily shelled, should I say, not bombed, heavily shelled by the Germans in the First World War. We're far enough out of the centre that the bombing shouldn't be too bad in this area, even though there was bombing in this area. But this is still all exists. This is all Victorian of that period, 1850s period. So it's a lovely area. We're going to then go up to a roundabout at the top. So this is, we walked quite a way. We walked a few kilometres now and hit the roundabout at the top, and we have the old proverbial McDonald's on there. You can't get it wrong. There's always a McDonald's. And we're going to turn right, and this is the road that would take us to Albert and onto the battlefields of the First World War. It's called Avenue de la Défense Passive, which means that somewhere along here, and I'm not quite sure where it is, there would have been underground bunkers, because when you see La Défense Passive, it's talking about after the Second World War, when France didn't want to be involved in the Cold War. It hadn't joined NATO, and it started to build, as well as having a fairly strong army, but it started to build an awful lot of shelters for its civilian population. So I think that's where the Avenue de la Défense Passive comes in, the name comes in. And then very quickly, we're actually going to come upon the prison. The prison is on our left-hand side. It's actually number 85 in Avenue de la Défense Passive. Built in 1904, so I could find a little bit about the story of the building of the prison. So built in 1904, still in use now. It had 707 prisoners were within it during the raid in 1944, and there's now only 326 prisoners that are at any one time in the prison. That's how many it can cope with. So obviously they were packed in a bit tighter during 1944 under the German occupation. And it's got 252 cells still to this day. So I think it's a remand prison at the moment. Now, I always get my clients, when we're actually having a look at it, we stop out here and get our cameras out, but I always make it clear, don't loiter too long with your cameras when you're outside a prison, because not very keen on people taking pictures of prisons from across the other side of the road. So I always get us in quite tight up to the wall so we can go and have a look at where the wall has been marked. The pointing has changed, so you can see where this section of the wall was blown out. And there's a plaque there commemorating the fact that 717 prisoners were in the prison. 100. I'll just give you the facts because it's just interesting to get them out the way here. 717 prisoners. 102 of those were killed during the raid, so there was a considerable loss of life from the bombing. 74 were wounded, but 258 escaped, and of that 258, 79 were actual resistance or political prisoners. Sadly, 2/3 of those will be recaptured fairly quickly, but of course that involved an awful lot of German units arriving to help in rounding them up and trying to find them. One of the other aspects, while the mosquitoes were attacking the prison, one of the groups of mosquitoes actually attacked the railway station to try and delay German soldiers being brought in to assist in recapturing them. So they did try and think it through, and they attacked the railway station as well.
Well, Pete, we're going to talk about the raid in a little bit of detail now because we're here at the site, at the prison. Just before we do, I wanted to... You mentioned that long walk down the boulevard, and something I just wanted to add is that Amiens is quite a captivating city, and I think on that stroll down that boulevard, that's a great place to sum it up. I'd say there's definitely an element of faded glory about Amiens, that there's some massive, gorgeous old houses, mostly houses, not too many in the public building space, but certainly private houses, immense private houses, just beautiful old, as you say, Victorian 19th century constructions, gorgeous. That beautiful French style with what we call sandstone in Australia. It's probably not. It's a different type of stone, but stone and brick, and just some absolutely stunning houses. Again, a little bit faded these days, but the architecture of the town is really quite captivating. You can spend a long time roaming the streets of Amiens just admiring the buildings, can't you?
Well, I do. When we're staying there and we've had our evening meal, people do different things. I do tend to go to a bar as well, but I always try and fit in somewhere, whether it be in the morning or in the evening, a quick walk around the town, and I try and go to an area that I've not walked before. And what I'm looking for is, I actually quite like the 1950s architecture, having knocked it with the railway station. But there's an interesting aspect, is the damage on the after the First World War was rebuilt in the 1930s, and then the Second World War in the 1950s. Now, 1930s and 1950s architecture is very similar, so you can actually wander about, and I'm trying to figure out whether that is a rebuild from the 1950s or a rebuild from the 1930s. So it's very interesting, and I enjoy walking about and looking how they've fitted in these rebuilt houses. And it's when you do that you realise how much of the city was destroyed in either war. There's an awful lot that sadly is missing. Also, after the war in the 1950s, the French did take an opportunity to do a lot of house clearing, clearing of what they would have seen as slum areas. So I think it's quite sad in some ways that the beautiful cathedral, and I always compare it to York, it's the nearest big cathedral to where I came from in the UK, and York has the old houses around the cathedral, which really kind of sits it very firmly in history, so you can see where the people lived around the cathedral. But here in Amiens, it's either rebuilt in a style that looks a little bit like, but most of it was destroyed, and what wasn't destroyed was actually cleared in slum clearances in the 1950s. I think it's a great shame they didn't save more of the old city. So having said that, as Matt was saying, there are still some very beautiful buildings around, and it's well worth having a walk around Amiens if you have the opportunity. One
of the most famous houses relates to the First World War, and it's a novel that depicts this house, which was written, I think, in the 70s or the 80s, but a very a good account of the First World War, called Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks, and it was set in Amiens for much of it, and a specific house that the key characters lived in. And that house was based on a real house, which is still there, which is on, I think it's the Rue de Conge, which is just around the corner from the restaurants down on the River Somme. And it's a grand old, again, in some places a little bit ramshackle, but a beautiful old house covered in ivy and just a dramatic sight on the street. So if you've read Birdsong and enjoyed that book, you can actually go and see the house that inspired the story. You're not as big a fan of Birdsong as I am, I think, Pete.
I was just going to say that. No, I'm not. Birdsong, not my favourite. It exaggerates everything. I don't like it very much. It's mainly dealing with the Tunnel War, and it exaggerates an awful lot. And even worse, the BBC made a drama out of it, and they took that exaggeration even further. So I think it really spoilt it. But what I did enjoy with Birdsong is the descriptions of Amiens before the First World War, and I thought they were excellent, and it really gave you a feel of what it was like. And so yes, you can it's an interesting book to read, and certainly I would recommend that you read it. It's a well-known book, and he's a very good author, I have to say.
So read the book and then go and have dinner down by the river and a nice bottle of French wine, and then wander around the corner and see the house that inspired the whole story. Let's get to the prison, Pete. Let's get to the raid. I mean, you've covered it very, very well. I think we have a really good understanding of what was going on. But I'm just trying to imagine standing on this street. I mean, obviously you wouldn't have wanted to be standing on this street in February 1944 and see these mosquitoes come screaming in. I mean, the Mosquito as an aircraft is just an iconic Second World War plane. I love the Mosquito. The idea that it's basically two very large wings strapped to two monstrous engines, and then just a very fast, very agile plane.
Yeah, it is. All wood, of course, which is one of the more interesting aspects of it. And I think it was my father's favourite aeroplane. I remember as a boy getting the Airfix kit and making a Mosquito. A great aircraft, and actually quite long-lived because it was fast. Even when the jet engines came in, the Mosquitoes continued to be built and continued to be used after the Second World War. So this is I'll give you a little bit of details of who it is that's attacking. So it's 140 wing of the RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force, and they were based at a place called Hunsdon in Hertfordshire, and they were selected to carry out the raid using Mosquito FB Mark 5s. So that was the one that we're using. And it's going to be 18 Mosquitoes from number 464 Squadron and number 487 Squadron, which is a New Zealand squadron. So there were New Zealanders involved in this raid. The chap that was going to lead them was Air Vice Marshal Basil Embry, but he was taken out of the raid at the last minute because he was also planning the D-Day landings that were coming up, and it was felt that it perhaps wasn't a good idea to have him flying over Europe and occupied Europe with all that information in his head. So Group Captain Percy Charles Pickard, DSO and 2 bars. I mean, this guy was your film star of the time. He's the one that is going to lead the film star style, I should say. That's the kind of feel that you get about him. But actually, he was a film star, which is fascinating because in 1941 he'd taken part in a film called Target for Tonight, which again another of my father's films that I watched with him, and it was a propaganda film that was intended to be a propaganda film, but it became a box office hit, and it was about a Whitley bomber. It was about a bomber raid against Germany, so he was in that. Another interesting aspect. He was also involved in what was called the Bruneville Raid, which was a raid, again another famous raid of paratroopers being dropped on to take out a radar network and to bring back parts of it to investigate what the Germans were doing as far as radar was concerned. And after that, he'd been involved in Lysanders, which are a very light aircraft used for dropping SOE, the spies and the people that are gathering information into France. So his life was one that of you'd have to say of excitement and partying. He was a bit of a party animal as well. So he must have been an interesting character. He's one of those guys that had he survived, I wonder what he would have gone on to do.
It wasn't, the Mosquitoes weren't just tasked with blowing out the walls. I mean, that was a very precise raid that they were involved in, blowing out the walls and blowing out the hole in the side of the prison so the prisoners could escape. But there was also, you were telling me, Pete, that there was a second instruction if the raid wasn't successful. And this is a pretty grim aspect of the whole thing. What was going to happen if they didn't succeed in breaching the walls?
Well, it's an interesting story because a French historian started looking into why the raid had actually taken place in its entirety. The belief had always been that the resistance had asked for help in the sense of trying to free these prisoners, and the story then was attached to that one of the prisoners was important because he knew some of the details of the Normandy landings. But when we started looking at it in detail, when this French historian started looking at it in detail, he couldn't find anywhere where there were any resistance cells or resistance fighters or units in France had actually requested assistance. And what he did find was that the request was coming from Britain. Could they attack the prison? So that's the first part of the story that's slightly odd. What Matt was referring to is the final instructions for the Mosquitoes. If they'd been unable to breach the walls, if they'd been unable to see no sign of anybody coming out of the prison, then the final flight of Mosquitoes had been tasked with flattening the prison and completely destroying it. And so again, we're back to this story. Was there somebody in the prison that really was important to the Normandy landings, who they really didn't want the Germans to interrogate? And certainly that's the implication. Why else would you do that? Why else would you say flatten the prison, kill everybody if you can't breach the walls? So we don't really know. You have to say we don't really know what maybe we will in the future when more and more files become available. But at the present time, we're not really sure why the raid took place. All we can say was the precision bombing was perfect. Well, actually strictly speaking, it's not quite true. The bombs were actually fused. I can't can't remember how many seconds, but it was too long. And the bombs were going through the target wall that they were supposed to hit, going through the buildings and actually detonating on the front. And so interestingly, when we go and look at the hole blown through the wall, it's one of the holes at the front onto the main road. Well, in fact, they were trying to take out the walls on the back, but the bombs were going right the way through before they actually detonated. So another interesting aspect. But no matter what, it still worked. They successfully took out the accommodation block. They took out the observation towers and everything else that they needed to do. So it was a very, very successful raid. Just to add something else, there were also typhoons operating here, protecting the mosquitoes. So while they were taking part in the raid, there was a mosquito squadron circling above and attacking likely targets as well. So they weren't just left to their own devices, the mosquitoes.
One of these interesting aspects, Pete, that we discussed before we started recording was that you mentioned to me Henry Moissan was a resistance fighter who was in the prison, and he refused to leave when the walls were breached because he was worried about retaliation. So it does again start to paint this picture that perhaps the raid was not as successful or necessary as we've been led to believe. And you even mentioned that after the raid, he called it an unnecessary bloodbath. The idea that they would do that. And I do understand that. It does seem a bit odd, doesn't it? If we don't have a specific reason for it, we say we've got these prisoners there, we're going to bomb the prison, we're going to kill a decent chunk of them. Some are going to escape, but 2/3 of those are going to be recaptured anyway. You kind of ask yourself, what was the point? What was going on? There is obviously more to the story than we know.
I think the things that I take from it is I think it's possible that there is somebody very important in there that we still don't know who he is. I think the other thing perhaps would be that they wanted to see if this would work, because they're going to go on and do several other precision bombing attacks against various buildings and things in other areas of France and other countries. So I think that's part of it. It's testing out is this going to work? Can we use planes for this absolute, detailed, almost scalpel-like taking out a building? So I think that there's an element of that as well. But I think you're right. I don't think we really have got to the bottom of the story yet, and I think we haven't got enough documentation from MI5, MI6 that will start to tell us what really the raid was about.
It's fascinating, these stories, particularly from the Second World War, where at the end of the war, we think we know the story. And then as time goes on, we realise we actually don't know very much about it at all. And the gaps in the story become larger as time goes on. So rather than know more about the war as we would normally expect to, we actually know less and less as time goes on. So it's exciting, though. It's one of those stories that I think is yet to be written. I have no doubt that at some stage in the future, a historian will uncover the documents that reveal exactly what was going on. And we'll do a follow-up podcast, no doubt, at that point, because I would be fascinated to know what the true story is, because it doesn't quite add up, does it? It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't pass the pub test, as they say here. That if you were standing around in the pub talking about it, it just does. There's just too much to the story we don't know. Like, why? The most important question: why in the hell did this occur in the first place? But just a fascinating story. We should talk about what happened to the group commander Percy Pickard. What happened to him specifically, because we know he didn't survive the raid.
No, well, sadly, he was tasked to hang about to do the. I should say again, this raid was well recorded. One of the planes was carrying cameras, so it was tasked to photograph and record so that there was a record. And again, odd. Yes, we are photographing, but this is a very specific raid, and they wanted a record to be brought back of exactly how it had gone. You can actually look at those pictures if you go online. You'll find some of the pictures taken by one of the mosquitoes. Pickard was hanging about to give the final. Yep, that's okay. That's been successful. And as he turned to leave, his plane was attacked. I think it was a Fokker-Wulf from one of the local. There were quite a few fighter stations around in the area, and the rear of his plane was literally shot off. His rear tail was shot off, and he went straight into the ground. So him and his navigator were both killed. And in fact, I'm just quickly looking up and seeing how many people lost their lives. Well, in fact, one of the Typhoon pilots was shot down, and he was killed. Sergeant H.S. Brown. Another New Zealander called Lieutenant Richard Webb Sampson. He was a navigator in the second of the Mosquitoes to be lost. The pilot survived and was captured as a POW. And then we have John Allen Broadley, Flight Lieutenant, and he's again another New Zealander. and he was the navigator to Picard, and they both sadly lost their lives. Now, interestingly, they're not all buried in the same place, and that's the next place we're actually going to go to, is where Picard and his navigator are buried, and they're buried literally just around the corner. We walk up the street a little bit further, and we'll get to a cemetery. It's a great big civil cemetery. It's on the same side as the prison, on the left-hand side, and it's the cemetery St. Pierre. And there's a Commonwealth War Grave section known as St. Pierre Cemetery, Amiens, and it's a Commonwealth War Grave cemetery literally attached to the civil cemetery. Obviously started in the First World War, as you'd expect. This was an evacuation centre for the wounded, so all of the soldiers that were buried within there are soldiers that died of their wounds. And then we have a Second World War section as well, and they're buried there. I always think it's quite sad. They're not side by side. You'd like to think that the pilot and the navigator, the bodies must have been recovered roughly at the same time, but they're not side by side. They're in different rows. They're almost behind each other, but they're buried in there.
Well, Pete, it's a fascinating story. I mean, we've covered a lot of angles here, and I don't actually feel we've obviously conclusively told the story, because, as we say, there's so many gaps in the story. But it's almost the mystery of the story makes it so tantalising and makes it worthwhile walking past that prison and having a look. And as we say, visitors who are listening to this podcast who go to the Somme will go past the prison many times as they drive in and out of Amiens. So it's again the hidden gems of history that are right there in front of us if we look for them. Just an extraordinary tale and an extraordinary walk.
It's an interesting story because it has been very well covered and very well written up, and that's what's so interesting about it. Is with so many historians and people have looked at it over the years. We even know the name of the German fighter pilot who shot down Picard's plane. There's so much information, but we still don't know exactly why the raid took place. So it is fascinating, and I would ask that if you're interested and you've enjoyed it, then go online and see what you can find out yourself. You'll get hooked. It's just a fascinating story.
Well, Pete, thank you once again for this walk across the battlefields. It's always a great pleasure, and look forward to doing it again with you next week.
Yep, looking forward to it, Matt.